Hello everyone. Let's subscribe to Relationship Stories before we forget. You won't want to miss what's coming up next.
When love is tested by the deepest desires, how far will you go to save it? Julie's confession wasn't about another man. It was about herself, her fears, and the life she felt slipping away. As her restless heart threatened to break their marriage, Mark is forced to confront a painful truth. The woman he loves is no longer the same. What happens when temptation meets honesty, and the desire for freedom collides with the vows they swore to keep? Shattered Vows is a gripping tale of betrayal, redemption, and the fragile threads that hold a marriage together. Will love be enough to heal the wounds, or will their vows be shattered forever? Julie handed Mark a glass of wine, her hand trembling ever so slightly. It was early evening, and the dim light cast shadows across her face, making her look distant, almost unreachable. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with something dark and unfamiliar, and Mark could feel the unease settling in. He took the glass from her, but his mind was racing. She hadn't said much all week, and her silence had created an invisible wall between them. Now, as she sat down across from him, he knew something was coming. Something that might change everything. The words when they came were a blow. Julie said she needed a separation. Mark blinked, unable to process what she had just said. It felt surreal, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Julie, the woman who had been his anchor, was now asking for space, for time away from him, from their life together. His chest tightened as he tried to ask her why, but the answer she gave him, something about needing clarity, about needing time for herself, felt vague, insufficient. She assured him it wasn't permanent, 6 months at most. But the way her voice trembled told him that even she didn't know if that was true. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between them became more oppressive. They moved around each other like strangers, barely speaking, going through the motions of their daily routines without any of the warmth that had once filled their home. Mark found himself searching for answers in the quiet moments when Julie wasn't around, replaying the last few months in his mind, trying to pinpoint when things had started to unravel. He couldn't understand it. There had been no major fights, no obvious signs that something was wrong. But now, every moment of silence felt like a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable end of their marriage. The tension escalated. Julie stayed out late more often, claiming she needed space to think, to be alone. Mark, left to his own thoughts, became consumed by suspicion. Was there someone else? It was the question that haunted him, gnawing at him in the quiet hours of the night when Julie wasn't beside him in bed. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something that went deeper than just needing time. It wasn't until a month later, after yet another strained dinner eaten in silence, that Mark finally confronted her. His frustration had built to the point of breaking, and he demanded to know if there was someone else. The words came out harsher than he intended, but the anger had been festering for too long. Julie didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of guilt and pain that twisted his gut. And then quietly she began to speak. "There's no one else," she said, her voice trembling. "But that doesn't mean I haven't thought about it." Mark felt his heart drop. His worst fear wasn't just in his head, it was real. She wasn't having an affair, but the thought of it had crossed her mind. Julie hesitated, her eyes filling with tears as she tried to explain. She spoke of her growing restlessness over the past year, how she felt like time was slipping away from her. At 30, she said, she felt her youth fading. The attention she once received from men, the small flirtations that had once made her feel powerful, had begun to fade as well. Terrified her. Weeks passed after this confession, and the distance between them grew even wider. Mark couldn't look at her without imagining the scenario she had described, the temptation she had felt, the attention she craved. It made him sick, and yet he couldn't pull away from her completely. She had been honest with him, brutally so, and despite the pain it caused, a part of him respected that honesty. But the hurt lingered. He could barely sleep, tossing and turning with the weight of her words heavy on his chest. Then, 2 months after that initial conversation, the truth came out in full. It was late one night when Julie finally broke down, her tears flowing freely as she confessed what had happened at the party months before. The party where Mark had first noticed something was off. She explained with shaky breaths, how Carol's cousin had flirted with her, how she hadn't pushed him away. Mark remembered that night vividly, how Julie had seemed different, distant, but he had brushed it off. Now, hearing her describe the details, his heart felt like it was being ripped apart. She had followed him outside, behind the garage where he had kissed her. And she had let him. Mark's stomach churned as she spoke, his mind racing through images he didn't want to see. She hadn't stopped him right away, had in fact been drawn to the feeling of being wanted by someone else, someone new. But when the moment came for things to go further, she had panicked. She pushed him away, unable to cross that final line. Mark listened, numb with disbelief. The fact that she hadn't gone through with it didn't offer him the comfort he thought it might. The intent had been there, and that was enough to break him. He stayed quiet, his fists clenched tightly in his lap as Julie sobbed, apologizing again and again. She hadn't known how to tell him. She had wanted to confess sooner, but the shame had swallowed her whole. Time seemed to crawl after that night. Another month passed, then two, and the emotional distance between them felt insurmountable. Julie spent more nights away, under the guise of work, though Mark wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Each time she left, the tension in the house lifted slightly, but it was replaced by a dull ache in Mark's chest, the feeling of being abandoned. It wasn't until 4 months after her initial request for separation that something shifted. Julie returned home from a work trip earlier than expected. Her demeanor completely changed. She seemed lighter, as if some great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. When she sat down with Mark that evening, her eyes were clear for the first time in months. She told him she had met a psychologist during her trip, someone who had helped her make sense of the turmoil she had been feeling. It wasn't about other men, she explained. It was something deeper. Julie's restlessness, the desire for attention, the fear of time slipping away. It all came down to one thing. She wanted to be a mother. She had been so focused on her career, so afraid of aging, that she hadn't allowed herself to recognize the real source of her anxiety. She wasn't yearning for freedom or excitement. She was yearning for a family, for a future with Mark that involved more than just the life they had built so far. Her desire for separation had been her way of running from that realization, but now she knew what she truly wanted. Mark sat in stunned silence as Julie spoke. It was as if everything suddenly made sense. The months of confusion, pain, and distance all led to this moment. She hadn't been pushing him away to hurt him. She had been trying to figure out what was missing in her life. And now, with tears in her eyes, she was asking for a future with him. A family. 6 months after that conversation, Julie was pregnant, and their relationship, once on the brink of collapse, had found a new sense of purpose. The tension and heartache that had nearly torn them apart had been replaced by hope and excitement for the life they were about to create together. The road had been long and painful, but they had come out the other side stronger than ever. But even as their family grew, with the impending arrival of their first child, the scars from their difficult journey remained. There were moments, quiet, late at night, when Mark would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the words Julie had confessed months before. It wasn't doubt in her, but the lingering echoes of betrayal that occasionally surfaced. He wondered if those thoughts would ever completely fade, or if they were part of the new reality of their love, a love that had endured its darkest test and survived, but not without leaving marks. Julie, too, had her moments of reflection. As her body changed with pregnancy, she occasionally caught glimpses of herself in the mirror, recalling the fears that had once gripped her so tightly. The fear of fading, of no longer being seen, still lingered at the edges of her mind, but now it was different. She had faced that fear head-on and understood it wasn't about beauty or desire. It was about what she truly wanted. A sense of belonging, of creating a life with Mark that mattered more than any fleeting attention. The family they were building together was proof that she had chosen the right path, even if the journey had nearly torn them apart. And so, as the months turned into years, they built their family, with all its challenges and joys. The pain of their near separation never fully disappeared, but it became part of their story. One they carried with them, not as a weight, but as a reminder of how fragile and precious love could be. They had shattered once, but they had pieced themselves back together, stronger in the places where they had been broken. How could you rebuild the trust that was lost? Did you think that Julie was a slut, or was she lost and finally found her bearings with Mark again?
That's the story I've shared with you today. If you enjoyed it, make sure to check out my playlist for more similar stories.